Hello, my name is Gary Hoover with TBM Consulting Group. Welcome to our podcast where we will discuss the topic of reshoring along with recent trends and observations on both successes and lessons learned with our guest, Harry Moser. We appreciate you all joining us. Harry is the founder of the Reshoring Initiative and has more than 5 decades of experience in manufacturing. Harry's passion to support U.S. manufacturing led him to create the initiative well before the word reshoring became part of our nation's regular vernacular. Harry has been a powerful voice in many media outlets on this topic. In addition, Harry was an advisor to President Obama's 2012 insourcing forum at the White House. Earlier this year, we at TBM invited Harry to speak to us about the decision-making process to both reshore and nearshore. On today's podcast, Harry and I will extend our discussion to discuss and learn more around some of the recent successes and challenges of U.S. companies bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. So, welcome, Harry. Glad to have you with us.
Great to be here, Gary. It's a pleasure to be back.
As often is the case, I guess it's quite important to understand some of these examples or themes by subsector within manufacturing. Are there certain industries that tend to be more of the leading edge today versus others that may be later or maybe more challenging?
But let me break it out. It's just slightly different from that. First, for the big companies, for the OEMs, think General Motors or GE or somebody like that, the immediate P&L benefits are minimal. They used to buy something for $7. Now I've got to convince them to pay $10 for it and believe they're going to make that up and all these other factors and the risks of getting decoupled or something in the future. So for them, it's a tough decision and you don't see immediate impact, but the value is in survival and customer retention, especially if things go really bad. Whereas for the supply chain companies, for the foundries and machine shops, whatever that supply them, the impact can be huge because they just picked up a 20 or 30% increase in volume and presumably at a halfway fair price. And so their sales volume, their profitability is increased substantially. So the OEM has to take it almost on faith because of that price difference, whereas the supplier, they're in good shape. Some other product characteristics that are worth thinking about, you can find sweet spots. So, for example, plastic is better than steel. Why do I say that? In the U.S., steel tends to be 10 to 20% more expensive than in many other countries, whereas plastic resin tends to be less expensive because of shale gas, which is used to make the resin. Things coming in from China, especially if they're subject to a 25% Section 301 tariff. The first, China is very risky now. Companies are trying to understand that. 25% thrown on top of the price, bam, all of a sudden it's more profitable here. Things that are automated, not too labor intense. Standard tooling. So in the U.S., unfortunately, molds and dies tend to be significantly more expensive than in China, whereas standard tooling like indexable carbide cutters and things like that are about the same cost. Products with seasonal or unpredictable demand, so a short supply chain makes a lot of sense. A product with a good working environment makes it easier to attract the workforce that you need to produce and succeed.
Excellent. If I may ask, Harry, so if you mentioned the looking at it through the lens of material type or types or supply chain versus not, we have a lot in our audience. Many of our audience members are part of the middle market. And so when you think of it by size of company, is there anything in that lens that would offer a different perspective, even if we're looking at it across the tool that you developed, the total cost of ownership calculator?
From my experience, generally the smaller companies tend to be the supply chain companies and the bigger companies tend to be the buyers, the OEMs, the ones that are buying from those smaller companies. So I get a lot more enthusiasm from the supply chain companies than I do from the OEMs, unfortunately, because the OEMs eventually have to make the decision. I think it's generally easier for the big companies to make the automation investments that are required, a little harder for the smaller companies to get the capital to make that investment and make the longer term decisions. On the other hand, the big companies often are so fixated on quarterly profitability and cash flow, whereas the smaller companies, especially privately owned companies, can take the longer term view, can act more like in Germany, that middle group is called the Mittelstand, and that's the 10 to 100 or so employee middle market company. And they invest and they hire and they train and they take the longer term view, and it should be easier for the U.S. smaller company to make that decision than for the big company, which is so beholden to Wall Street.
Yeah, it's having worked in Germany and worked with the middle market, it is interesting because you typically have a smaller group of people who are deciding and thinking of the longer term, as you mentioned, in that sense, how important it is for them to make those decisions and not lose talent in the longer run. Now, one thing we've talked about the acceleration of reshoring to a degree. You started the initiative, I think, back in 2010 formally, but that acceleration seems to be increasing. So if we think about that, are there certain things beyond the obvious that are driving the more recent acceleration of reshoring? Why now?
Have seen their own vulnerability. So even without the government incentives, the companies are recognizing that they're more secure, their future is more secure, their shareholders are more secure if they take the more, I wouldn't call it conservative, I'd say the more aggressive stance and decide to produce or source more here in the U.S. And in some cases, the U.S., if the product is too labor intense, the U.S. may not be the right choice. Mexico, for example, can be the right choice because the wage rates in Mexico are maybe 30% less than in China, and you eliminate most of the duty and the freight and the carrying cost of inventory and all these difficulties. Time zone differences, language differences are smaller. So sometimes Mexico is the right choice rather than the U.S.
Harry, thank you so much for your time. I want to thank you for your expertise and your continued work around this topic, as we know you were here before it was, let's say, cool to be reshoring. And so we look forward to having further discussions with you going forward and tracking this. We'll also be tracking our overall productivity within manufacturing and several subsectors, which will be a sister component to what we're discussing today. And also, I just want to thank everyone out there for listening.